The call for help. Across the vastness of the galaxy, peace had always been a fragile thing. Many civilizations lived side by side, each in its own corner of space. Yet, deep down, every species knew that the galaxy could not remain peaceful forever. Danger had a way of finding even the most secure corners of space, and that danger had arrived in the most terrifying form imaginable. The Galactic Council, made up of the most powerful alien species, had been meeting for weeks. The situation was becoming dire. A new, unknown enemy had appeared out of nowhere, and the peacekeepers of the galaxy were failing to stop them. Entire star systems had fallen in just a matter of days. The powerful fleets of the galaxy's most respected civilizations were useless against this unseen threat. The invaders were ruthless, unrelenting, and unlike anything the galaxy had ever faced before. But the Council had one last hope. Far from the bustling galactic core, in the farthest reaches of the galaxy, the Deathworlders lived. Legends surrounded them. Few had ever seen them, and fewer still had lived to tell the tale. They were feared, respected, and revered by every civilization. Their very name sent shivers down the spines of even the most battle-hardened warriors. The Deathworlders had once been part of the galaxy's defense systems, but over time they had withdrawn into the shadows. They had their own rules. They fought their own battles. And for the longest time, no one had dared to ask for their help. But now, the galaxy had no choice. In the Council's chamber, the representatives of the various alien species stood in silence. A holographic screen flashed before them, showing the faces of the galaxy's most powerful leaders, each of them struggling to hide the fear in their eyes. For the first time, they were all united in one desperate cause. They had sent out a message, a call for help, and they all knew who they had to contact. The Deathworlders. A single figure, tall and imposing, stood at the center of the council chamber. The representative of the most powerful and ancient race in the galaxy, the Xenaxians, was the first to speak. "We have no choice. The Deathworlders are our only hope. If they do not answer this call, we will all perish." The room fell silent. No one had spoken the words aloud before. The idea of seeking the Deathworlders' help had always been seen as a last resort, a dangerous gamble. But it was clear to everyone in the room now that it was the only choice left. The holographic image of the galaxy flickered, and the council leader activated the emergency transmission system. The message was simple, yet desperate. A plea for the Deathworlders to come to the galaxy's aid. It was a message that would be sent out across the stars, across millions of light years, until it reached the Deathworlders' domain. As the message was sent, the room filled with tension. The air was thick with uncertainty. The Deathworlders were known to be elusive, mysterious, and nearly impossible to reach. The Council had no way of knowing if their message would even be received, or if it would be ignored. Still, they had no other choice. The galaxy's most powerful leaders, who had once ruled with confidence, now sat in fear. The hope they had once taken for granted was slipping away. No one knew how much time they had left before the invaders would strike again. Every second counted. Days passed in complete silence. No response came. The galaxy's great fleets had been mobilized, but each time they encountered the invaders, they were defeated with alarming ease. The unknown enemy seemed to anticipate every move. Their weapons were far more advanced than anything the galaxy had ever seen. And then, just as the Council began to lose all hope, the impossible happened. The communication system, long dormant, suddenly activated. A single harsh signal echoed through the galaxy. The message was brief, its words clear and heavy with meaning. "We are coming." The room erupted in shock. The Deathworlders had heard the call. They had answered. The Council knew that the galaxy's fate was now in the hands of these mysterious, deadly warriors. The Deathworlders were unlike any force the galaxy had ever encountered. They didn't fight for glory or wealth. They fought because they had no other choice. The galaxy would soon learn that the Deathworlders did not need allies. They would crush any enemy that dared to threaten them. The Council's fear turned to awe. The Deathworlders had always been a myth, a distant legend whispered about in secret. Now, they were real, and they were on their way. As the transmission ended, the representatives exchanged uncertain glances. The war that had already begun was about to take a turn no one had expected. The galaxy, once at peace, was about to be thrown into a conflict that would decide the fate of all life. The Deathworlders were coming, and no one knew what to expect. The stars shimmered in the darkness of space, silent witnesses to the events unfolding across the galaxy. The Galactic Council's distress call had been sent, but for days there had been no response. Hope was fading. On the capital world of Tellurian Prime, where the council chamber stood, tension ran high. The most powerful leaders of the galaxy had gathered, waiting for an answer that might never come. Fear hung in the air like a heavy mist. The enemy was closing in, their fleets unstoppable. Defenses crumbled wherever they attacked. Planets burned. Then, the silence was shattered. A sudden alert rang through the command halls, shaking every council member from their despair. The communication officers scrambled to their stations, their hands trembling as they looked at the incoming signal. Unidentified fleet detected, the voice reported. Massive energy signatures. They just appeared out of nowhere. The council members froze. The enemy never arrived like this. The invaders attacked in waves, creeping into systems one by one. This was something different, something unseen. The council leader, a tall Xanaxian with gleaming silver eyes, stepped forward. On screen, he ordered. The main display flickered to life, revealing a sight that no one in the chamber had expected to see. A fleet, a massive towering fleet of warships, black as the void, stretching across the cosmos like a swarm of silent monsters. Their hulls bore scars of countless battles, their weapons gleaming with untold power. They moved without hesitation, without fear. Then, a second transmission came through. "We heard your call." The voice was deep, cold, and filled with the weight of 1,000 wars. It sent a shiver through every being in the room. It was them, the Deathworlders. The council members stared in shock, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. Stories had been told about the Deathworlders, tales of warriors who thrived in the deadliest environments, who fought wars no one else could survive, but few had ever seen them in action. Until now, the fleet moved with terrifying precision, descending toward Tellurian Prime like an unstoppable force. They didn't ask for permission. They didn't send diplomats. They arrived as only Deathworlders could, with power, dominance, and an unspoken warning. As the first ships entered the planet's orbit, the council chamber erupted into chaos. Some leaders whispered in fear. Others clutched their seats, as if the very presence of these warriors might destroy them. A small delegation of Deathworlders requested landing clearance. The council, too stunned to refuse, granted it immediately. Moments later, the first Deathworlder ship touched down. The ramp lowered, and from the shadows emerged figures unlike anything the council had ever seen. They were tall, armored in battle-worn exosuits, their very presence radiating authority. Their leader stepped forward, a human, towering over most of the council members. His eyes, cold and calculating, scanned the room as if measuring every person in it. Silence fell upon the chamber. Then the human spoke. "Tell us everything." The war had just changed. The galaxy was about to witness what it truly meant to fight alongside Deathworlders. The council chamber was filled with an eerie silence as the Deathworlder leader's voice echoed through the halls. "Tell us everything." No one spoke at first. The Galactic Council, once the most powerful ruling body in the known universe, suddenly felt small in front of these terrifying warriors. The Deathworlders weren't just another fleet. They were legends, monsters to some, saviors to others. The council leader, Tellurian Prime, cleared his throat and stepped forward. "The enemy moves swiftly," he began. They have conquered 5 systems in the past week. Our forces were crushed. We cannot stop them. You can't, but we can. The human commander's words sent chills through the room. He wasn't asking. He wasn't negotiating. He was stating a fact. The council members exchanged uneasy glances. Could they really trust these beings? The Deathworlders were known for their brutality, their willingness to fight wars no one else dared to. But now, they were the only hope left. A holographic map flickered to life in the center of the chamber, displaying the galaxy and the enemy's movements. The enemy fleet was a dark stain, spreading like a virus across the star systems. The human studied the map for only a moment before speaking again. "We've seen worse." The council leader frowned. "You don't understand. Their ship's air. Irrelevant." The human gestured to his own fleet. "You called for help. We answered. Now let us do what we do best." Celerin hesitated. There was no emotion in the human's voice, no fear, no arrogance, just certainty. Another council member, a reptilian being with dark red scales, stepped forward. "And what do you expect in return?" The human smirked. "Survive. That's all the payment we need." The words left the council stunned. They had expected demands, resources, planets, control. But the Deathworlders wanted only the fight itself. Finally, Celerin nodded. "Then let us show you what we're up against." The map shifted, displaying a live feed of the warfront. The enemy fleet had reached another planet. Their massive warships loomed over its surface, preparing for another ruthless assault. The human commander didn't flinch. Instead, he turned to his officers. "We move now." The Deathworlders never hesitated. They didn't wait for bureaucratic approval or diplomatic debates. They saw a battle, and they answered it with fire and steel. As the Deathworlder fleet roared to life, the council members watched in awe and fear. They had called for help, but they had just unleashed something far beyond their understanding. The galaxy was about to learn what happened when Deathworlders went to war. The battlefield was chaos. From the bridge of his command ship, Commander Dane of the Deathworlder fleet watched the enemy forces tighten their grip around the besieged planet. Fires raged across its surface, and desperate distress signals filled every comm channel. The enemy ships hovered like vultures, ready to deliver the final blow. But they weren't prepared for what was coming. "All ships, engage." With that single command, the Deathworlder fleet surged forward like a tidal wave. Massive warships, forged in the hellish conditions of their homeworlds, punched through enemy lines without hesitation. The first enemy dreadnought never had a chance. A Deathworlder battleship rammed through its shields with brute force, tearing into its hull with devastating plasma fire. The alien vessel exploded in a violent burst, sending debris scattering into space. The enemy fleet scrambled to respond, their once perfect formation breaking apart under the sheer aggression of the Deathworlder assault. Inside the Galactic Council's war room, Celerin Prime and the other leaders watched in stunned silence. "They fight like monsters," one of the council members whispered. "No," Celerin corrected. His voice was filled with something between fear and admiration. "They fight like survivors." On the battlefield, Deathworlder strike teams boarded enemy ships with terrifying speed. The enemy was used to wars fought at a distance. Careful strategies, calculated movements. But the Deathworlders weren't like that. They preferred close combat, where their raw strength and unbreakable endurance turned them into nightmares. Enemy soldiers screamed as armored Deathworlders tore through their defenses. Bullets and energy blasts barely slowed them down. The Deathworlders fought with a ferocity no other species could match. Commander Dane's ship shook violently as enemy fire rained down upon them. His officers scrambled to stabilize the shields, but he barely reacted. Instead, he focused on his target, the enemy flagship at the center of the invasion force. "Bring us in close," he ordered. "Sir, their defenses won't matter." His officers didn't argue. They had seen this before. They knew what their commander was capable of. As their ship pushed forward, the Deathworlder fleet followed, cutting a direct path through the enemy. Explosions erupted across the battlefield, lighting up the void with fire and destruction. The enemy flagship turned its weapons toward them. Dozens of cannons locked onto Dane's ship, preparing to wipe them from existence. But the Deathworlders were already ahead of them. Fire everything. Every weapon on the Deathworlder fleet unleashed its fury at once. Plasma beams, railguns, missiles. It was an onslaught like no other. The enemy flagship's shields collapsed in seconds, its hull rupturing under the sheer force of the assault. And then, the final blow. Dane's ship crashed into the weakened flagship, its reinforced hull tearing through the enemy's core. The flagship detonated in a chain reaction, a blinding explosion consuming what remained of the enemy fleet. As the fire faded and the battlefield fell silent, the Galactic Council members let out a breath they hadn't realized they were holding. The Deathworlders had won. But as they stared at the burning wreckage of what was once an unstoppable enemy force, one terrifying truth settled over them. The Deathworlders were not just warriors. They were the storm. The battlefield was silent now, except for the flickering embers of destroyed warships and the occasional burst of static from damaged communication relays. The enemy fleet had been utterly annihilated, their once mighty armada reduced to nothing more than drifting wreckage. But the Deathworlders were not celebrating. Commander Dane stood at the bridge of his flagship, looking at the ruined world below. Fires raged across the surface, cities lay in ruins, and countless innocent lives had been lost before they had arrived. He clenched his fists. They had won, but at what cost? "Status report," he commanded, his voice steady despite the weight pressing down on his chest. His second-in-command, Captain Duran, responded instantly. "Enemy forces completely neutralized. Our losses are minimal, but several ships took heavy damage. Civilian casualties on the planet are high." Dane exhaled sharply. He had seen war before, but this was a massacre. The enemy hadn't come to conquer. They had come to exterminate. "Send search and rescue teams," he ordered. "Get medical ships down there. Every survivor we can find, we save." Captain Joran hesitated. "Sir, this is not our war. The Council only asked us to stop the invasion, not rebuild the planet." Dane turned to him, his expression hard. "Then they should have asked someone else. We don't leave the weak to die." Joran nodded, understanding. The Deathworlders had a reputation for being brutal warriors, but they were also fiercely protective of those who couldn't defend themselves. Within minutes, the Deathworlder fleet deployed its ground teams. Dropships roared down into the devastated cities, and armored soldiers spread out to locate survivors. The air was thick with smoke, and the stench of burning metal and flesh filled the ruins. As Dane descended with his team, he saw the true horror of what had happened. Bodies lay scattered across the streets. Civilians, soldiers, even children. The enemy had shown no mercy. A weak voice called out from the rubble. Please. Help." Dane turned sharply, rushing toward the sound. He found a young alien girl trapped beneath a collapsed structure. Her skin was pale, her breathing ragged. She was barely clinging to life. Without hesitation, Dane knelt and began lifting the debris. His enhanced Deathworlder strength made it look easy, but inside, he felt anything but. The girl whimpered as the weight shifted, and then finally, she was free. Her wide eyes locked onto his. Are you here to kill us too?" she whispered. Dane felt something tighten in his chest. He knelt down, his voice softer than before. "No, we're here to save you." Tears welled in her eyes, and for the first time in what seemed like an eternity, she let herself hope. While the Deathworlders worked tirelessly to save as many as they could, the Galactic Council convened an urgent discussion. Ambassador Accelerin sat at the head of the table, his usually calm demeanor replaced with barely concealed anxiety. Around him, the other council members murmured in hushed, fearful voices. "They wiped out an entire armada in hours," one alien said, his voice trembling. "Do you understand what that means? That fleet was one of the strongest in the galaxy, and they tore through it like it was nothing. They're not just warriors," another added. "They are predators. Monsters. If they ever turn against us." Celerin slammed his hand down, silencing the room. "Enough." His voice was sharp, commanding. "Yes, they are powerful. Yes, they fight like no others. But they did not come to conquer. They came because we begged them to." Silence settled over the chamber. No one wanted to admit it, but he was right. A nervous ambassador from a peaceful world spoke up. "Then, what do we do? How do we control them?" Zelerin's gaze hardened. "You don't." The room tensed. "You think of them as weapons, as beasts you can leash," he continued. "But they are not. They are warriors who choose their battles. If we treat them like a threat, they will become one. If we respect them, they might just be our greatest allies." Some nodded, while others remained unconvinced. But one thing was certain: no one in that room would ever dare to make an enemy of the Deathworlders. Back on the planet, the rescue operations continued for hours. Dane and his team had found hundreds of survivors, some wounded, some barely hanging on. Medical ships worked tirelessly, their advanced technology stabilizing those who could be saved. The young alien girl Dane had saved clung to his arm, refusing to let go. She had lost everything: her family, her home. But in Dane, she saw something she had never seen before. The eerie silence that had settled over the battlefield was short-lived. Deep in space, sensors aboard the Deathworlder fleet began picking up strange signals, distorted transmissions, ghostly echoes of something moving in the void. Commander Dane stood at the command deck, his expression grim as he stared at the incoming data. "Sir," Captain Duran reported, his voice tense, "we've intercepted enemy chatter. They're regrouping, and they're bringing reinforcements." Dane's jaw tightened. He had expected this. The enemy had lost a fleet, but they hadn't been defeated entirely. Now they were coming back, angrier and more determined than ever. "How many?" Dane asked. Joran hesitated before answering. "Multiple dreadnoughts. Hundreds of warships. They outnumber us 10-1. The bridge fell silent. Even the hardened warriors of the Deathworlder fleet knew the odds were grim. "They don't just want revenge," Joran continued. "They want to wipe us out." Dane exhaled slowly, his mind already racing through strategies. Retreat was an option, but it wasn't in their nature. The civilians they had saved were still recovering, and if they left now, there would be no one to protect them. No, running wasn't an option. "Prepare for battle," he ordered. "If they want war, we'll give it to them." Joran nodded and relayed the command. The fleet came alive with movement. Guns charged, shields powered up, and every ship braced for the fight ahead. As the enemy fleet dropped out of hyperspace, the sheer size of their forces became clear. Their warships stretched across the darkness like a swarm of locusts, blotting out the stars. Dane stood firm, watching as the enemy made their move. "They think they have the advantage," Joran muttered. "They don't know who they're dealing with." Dane smirked. "They'll learn." The enemy fleet opened fire first. Beams of plasma and high-energy missiles streaked toward the Deathworlder fleet. But the Deathworlders didn't panic. They didn't retreat. Instead, they struck back. The battle erupted in a fury of fire and destruction. Deathworlder warships, smaller and fewer in number, moved with deadly precision. They weaved through enemy formations, targeting weak points with ruthless efficiency. One by one, enemy warships exploded in violent bursts of flame. But it wasn't enough. For every enemy ship they destroyed, more seemed to take its place. The Deathworlders fought like demons, but the enemy had sheer numbers on their side. Dane's ship shuddered as enemy fire slammed into the shields. Warning alarms blared across the bridge. "Shields at 50%, Joran shouted. Dane gritted his teeth. "We're not done yet." Dane knew they couldn't win this battle through brute force alone. They needed a plan, something unexpected, something the enemy wouldn't see coming. And then an idea struck him. Joran, reroute all power to the main engines. Dane commanded. Prepare for a full-speed charge. Joran's eyes widened. Sir, if we do that, we'll lose our shields. I know, Dane interrupted, but if we break their formation, we might just turn the tide. Joran hesitated for only a second before nodding. Aye, sir. The Deathworlder flagship roared forward, engines burning at maximum output. The enemy fleet, caught off guard, scrambled to react. Dane's ship slammed straight through the enemy's front line, cannons firing at point-blank range. The sheer force of the attack sent enemy warships spiraling out of control. And then the rest of the Deathworlder fleet followed. With their formation broken, the enemy fleet lost its coordination. Their overwhelming numbers became a disadvantage as their ships collided in the chaos. One by one, the Deathworlders tore them apart. When the battle finally ended, space was filled with the wreckage of destroyed warships. The Deathworlders had won, but the cost was high. Many of their ships were heavily damaged. Some would never fly again, and the lives lost. Dane stood on the bridge, looking out at the debris field. His body ached, his mind exhausted. But they had done it. They had stood their ground. Joran approached, his expression weary. We've received a message from the Galactic Council. They saw the battle. They want to negotiate. Dane let out a tired chuckle. Of course they do. They had proven themselves. And now, the galaxy would never forget the day the Deathworlders stood alone and won. The battlefield was silent. The wreckage of countless ships drifted through the void, flickering with dying embers of fire and energy. The Deathworlder fleet, battered and scarred, remained standing. Against all odds, they had emerged victorious. But the war was not over yet. Commander Dane stood on the bridge, his uniform stained with sweat and soot. His body ached, but his mind remained sharp. The enemy had been dealt a devastating blow, but something in his gut told him that this was not their final move. The enemy was ruthless, and they would not accept defeat so easily. Joran approached him, his face grim. Sir, we intercepted another transmission. The enemy high command is still alive. They have retreated for now, but intelligence suggests they are regrouping. This war isn't over. Dane exhaled slowly, his fists clenching at his sides. He had suspected as much. They had crippled the enemy's fleet, but their leadership was still intact. If they were allowed to recover, they would return stronger, angrier, more determined than ever to wipe out the Deathworlders. The only way to end this war for good was to eliminate the enemy's leadership completely. We can't give them time to rebuild, Dane said. If they retreat, we pursue. If they hide, we hunt them down. This war ends on our terms. Joran hesitated. Sir, our forces are exhausted. We need repairs, reinforcements. If we push too hard now, we might not have enough strength left when the final battle comes. Dane looked around the bridge. His crew was drained, running on sheer willpower alone. Their ships, though still operational, had suffered heavy damage. The enemy had thrown everything at them, and they had barely survived. Charging headfirst into another battle could be suicide, but waiting would be worse. If we give them time, they will come back stronger. We cannot afford that, Dane said. We will push forward, but we'll be smart about it. We strike where they're weakest, cut off their supply lines, and force them into a position where they have no choice but to fight us on our terms. Joran nodded, though his concern remained. I hope you're right, sir. The fleet moved out. Every ship that could still fly followed the flagship as they pursued the remnants of the enemy forces. The Deathworlders were wounded, but they were still the deadliest warriors in the galaxy. And they would not stop until this war was over. Days passed as they tracked the enemy's retreat. The enemy fleet had split up, likely trying to regroup at a hidden stronghold. But the Deathworlders were relentless. They launched quick, precise attacks on smaller enemy convoys, cutting off their escape routes and forcing them to regroup in one location. Each strike weakened the enemy forces further. Finally, after relentless pursuit, the enemy was cornered. Their command fleet had retreated to a heavily fortified station on the edge of an uncharted system. It was their last stronghold, their final defense. If the Deathworlders could break them here, the war would be over. The enemy knew this too. Their defenses were formidable, their weapons charged, their fleet positioned for a last stand. They had nowhere left to run. Dane stood at the helm of his ship, watching the enemy fleet on the tactical display. This was it. One last battle. One last push. All ships, prepare for final engagement, Dane ordered. The Deathworlder fleet surged forward, weapons blazing. The enemy responded with everything they had. The battle that followed was the most brutal of the war. Explosions lit up the darkness, turning space into a storm of fire and destruction. The Deathworlders fought with everything they had, their determination unyielding. Dane's ship led the charge, cutting through enemy defenses with brutal efficiency. The enemy flagship, the command center of their entire war effort, loomed ahead. It was heavily armored, protected by layers of shields and firepower. But it had one weakness. Its power core was exposed at the rear. If they could get close enough, a direct hit would tear the ship apart from the inside. "Bring us in close," Dane commanded. "Target the core. End this now." The Deathworlder fleet pushed forward, breaking through the last line of enemy defenses. Enemy warships fell one by one, their formations crumbling. Dane's ship closed the distance to the flagship, dodging incoming fire with expert precision. "Fire everything we have at the core," Dan ordered. The ship's cannons unleashed a devastating barrage. The enemy flagship's shields buckled, then shattered. The final blast struck the core directly. For a moment, there was silence. Then, in an instant, the enemy flagship erupted in a massive explosion. The remaining enemy ships hesitated. Their command was gone. Their leaders were dead. And in that hesitation, the Deathworlders struck with full force. Within minutes, the last remnants of the enemy fleet were wiped out. The war was over. Dane stood on the bridge, watching the wreckage drift through space. The battle had been won, but the cost had been high. He knew they would mourn the fallen, but for now, they had achieved what they had set out to do. Jaren approached. "Sir, we've received transmissions from the Galactic Council. They want to negotiate peace." Dane let out a tired chuckle. Now they want peace. They saw the battle. They saw what we did. The entire galaxy saw it, Jaren said. They know now. Deathworlders are not to be underestimated. Dane looked out at the stars. Their people had been seen as monsters, as threats, as uncontrollable warriors. But today they had proven something else. They had proven that when the galaxy called for help, the Deathworlders answered. And when they did, nothing could stand in their way.